But does so-called white America not only not understand the issues of policing in black communities, but doesn't want to? That's the claim by Tim Wise, journalist and author, who says that in 1962, 85% of whites said that black children had just as good a chance as white children to get a good education in their communities. A claim so self-evidently absurd in retrospect that it calls into question the ability of whites to perceive even the most elemental realities of the country in which they lived. I spoke with Tim Wise earlier, and I asked him to explain that statement.
You know, it's one thing in 2015 to believe that the United States is a post-racial country. You can almost understand why people would think that, because we have these outward signs, outward manifestations of progress. But the point is, even in the early 60s, before the civil rights laws, when we were still a segregated country, really an apartheid state, white America, by and large, didn't see the problem, even though it was on their television screens every night. I mean, that's the year of the March on Washington, 1962, the year before that, actually. So the fact that white America has consistently, even when things were obvious in retrospect, not seeing the problem tells us that we have a significant gap in perception between white America on the one hand, people of color on the other. And I think that that is what we're seeing with the uprising in Baltimore, in Ferguson, all around the country, that people of color are experiencing the country one way, and therefore they perceive its institutions one way. White America perceives it differently because, by and large, we're experiencing it differently. It isn't that we are uncaring, unconcerned, or mean and evil people. It's that being white means never having to know the reality of those who live a very different experience. And that, to me, is the core of our problem in this country.
20, 30, 40 years from now, do you think the people in this country will look back on this particular time with the same retrospect that we look back into that civil rights era with?
I think it's very possible. I mean, right now, the numbers are very clear that for most white Americans, even though there seems to be some emerging consciousness around police misconduct and criminal justice system disparities, it's very much like it was in the early 60s. There's a core of white folks who seem to be getting that and acting in solidarity with the movement to change that and to make that better, but a vast majority who seem to be completely checked out. So hopefully we'll be able to not have to take 30 or 40 years to see what's right in front of us. Hopefully we can narrow that time frame, because otherwise we're just going to keep repeating these cycles of denial and consternation and anger and hostility rather than coming together to fix the problem.
Certainly. So I want to ask you about this other portion of your article. You talk about the fact that in white America and within white sections of America, there are riots. And you say we do burn our own communities and we do riot for far less valid reasons than any for which persons of color have ever hoisted a brick, a rock, or a bottle. And you bring up things like riots after football games, basketball games, even that pumpkin festival that happened in New Hampshire, how vastly different that is covered by media and perceived by the public versus what we saw in Baltimore, for instance.
Right. I mean, when white folks riot, whether it's after a football game or because Penn State fired Joe Paterno, who had, basically covered up for a child molester on his staff for years, or whether it's Woodstock 99, the music festival in 1999, where, there were literally rapes, assaults, robberies going on in the mosh pit during the concert. White folks, if that had been black folks at a hip hop show in New York City or anywhere else in the country, it would have been looked at as a cultural pathology. So part of our problem is recognizing that a lot of the behaviors that we ascribe to low-income folks, particularly poor folks of color, are just as common among middle and upper middle income white folks, but we don't perceive them the same way. Riots are one, drug use is another. The drug rates, for example, in this country are overwhelmingly identical between white folks and people of color, and yet when it comes to drug arrest, people of color 3, 4, 5 times more likely to be arrested. So we have to de-racialize the idea of pathology, and unfortunately the media, in terms of how they portray Baltimore and Ferguson and all of these uprisings against police misconduct, have continued to further a narrative that says those people are pathological, they're the violent ones, they're the dangerous ones, rather than looking at this as a larger systemic phenomenon.
Well, and again, I think you make a very important point that the things that many times that take place as a result of riots whether it be the Pumpkin Festival or what's happening at Woodstock 99, not even close in comparison to the complaints that these people have within black communities, where they're saying we're being arrested at extremely high rates, mass incarceration, and even the killing of young black men at the hands of police officers. I also want to ask you about the housing issue, and you talk about the segregation that's gone on even since the 60s in terms of race-based housing discrimination. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, we know the best estimates suggest there are at least 2 million, maybe as many as 4 million cases a year of race-based discrimination against people of color when they're looking to either purchase a home or rent an apartment. So they're either not shown the same number of units, or they're charged more, they're quoted a higher price, they're given a higher interest rate, they're steered into certain neighborhoods. So even though it's not as blatant and obvious as it was, let's say, before the Fair Housing Act of 1968, it's still happening millions of times a year. That, on top of, as I talk about in the piece, decades of institutional policies that actually destroyed housing in black communities like Baltimore to put interstates through the heart of the city, or for so-called urban renewal, which really meant building office parks, office buildings, parking lots, shopping malls that white folks would work in mostly, keeping black and brown folks in the city because they couldn't move to the suburbs because of discrimination. So in fact, the United States and local government combined conspired in a lot of ways, I don't mean it conspiratorially, but worked together to destroy housing for people of color, even as it was subsidizing housing in the suburbs. And that was official government policy right out there in the open. By the late 1960s, 1/5 of all urban housing lived in by black Americans had been destroyed for this so-called economic development. That's how the ghetto, so to speak, came to be the ghetto. And unless we understand that, we look at the uprising in Baltimore as this purely irrational action based on one incident, the death of Freddie Gray, when in fact it is related to a plethora of incidents over 3, 4, 5, 6 generations.
And so much of the reason that we view, I think, especially across America, we view these situations kind of in a vacuum is because of the way media covers it. But I want to ask you about one other thing you said here in this article, and it's kind of a stunning statement, but I think it rings true. You say, "I beg to remind you that George Washington was not a practitioner of passive resistance. Neither the early colonists nor the nation's founders fit with the Gandhian tradition. There were no sit-ins at King George's palace, no horseback freedom rides to effect change. There were just guns, lots and lots of guns." I'll give you the last word based on that statement.
Right. I mean, I think that's a critical point to remember, that while we lecture black folks and poor folks about violence, quote unquote, when they loot, quote unquote, a CVS or a liquor store, we need to remember that change in this country, including the change that most white Americans take for granted, the very founding of the country, was rooted in violence. So for us, white Americans, to lecture black and brown folks about being nonviolent and being peaceful is sort of precious, given the history of this country, given the face of the American president that is, at least as of now, on the $20 bill, Andrew Jackson. I know they're talking about changing that, but this is a man who was implicated in mass genocide of indigenous people, and yet we're going to tell black folks to engage in nonviolence. It seems to me we're getting it a little bit twisted. If we want nonviolence at the retail level, we have to practice nonviolence at the wholesale, national, and systemic level. And I guarantee that if that violence, if that institutional violence stops, the retail violence in the streets will stop as well.
Critically important points. Author and anti-racism activist Tim Wise, your time and your insight, much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.